You,
Tell me when to
I
stop
think you all.
eating.
No, you do you. This is about, keep eating. You got to fuel up.
Okay. Or it's not.
Small groups. I'm not so worried about microphones or cameras tonight. It is being recorded. If you do not want to be recorded, please don't turn your mic or your camera on. And if you'd like me to ask a question instead, just send it in the message either to the group or to me, and I will ask the question. So without further ado, I'll get started. So who's Bruce? Bruce is a runner. He's an advocate, an educator, a sport historian. Bruce is someone who will always open a door and lend an ear to you in your time of need. Bruce is also an Olympian, attending the 1964 Tokyo Games, where he competed in both the 5,000 and 10,000 meter. He's got quite the range, competing in everything from the 440 yards up to the marathon, and including winning the 1974 Atlanta Marathon. In addition, Bruce has a long history at the University of Toronto, teaching in the Faculty of Kinesiology for many, many years, and his most recent post, which he's shortly retired from, was the principal for U of T's Scarborough campus. Bruce is the author of 8 books, Tom Longboat, The Death of Hockey, The Political Economy of Sport, The Athlete's Rights in Canada with Mary Eberts, Critical Support for Sport, The History and Politics of Sport for Development with Simon Darnell and Russell Field, The Struggle for Canadian Sport, which is in my queue of books to read, and Why We're Here Tonight, A Runner's Journey. He also has 2 kids' books, Hockey Showdown and Who's a Soccer Player. But before we dive in, I'm going to hand this over to Bruce to let him also introduce himself.
Well, thank you very much, Sasha, and I'm delighted to be here and honored to be invited to contribute to these conversations. I like all the things that you said by way of introduction, but basically I'm a runner. I've loved to run all my life, and although I don't run anymore because of arthritis, I still look lovingly at those who run and wish I was out there when I walk or when I cycle. I see myself as an activist. I see myself as an ally in all of the important struggles for equity and justice. And because sport is not only about performance, but it's about culture and about its values. Sport has socialized me to be very proud of the fact that I'm a Canadian, and that's very important to my sense of identity, and an Olympian. And although it's been years since I competed in the Olympics, I still am deeply involved in the Olympic project and deeply committed to the Olympic ideals. Even in these very, very perilous times, the idea that through Olympic sport and the shared experience of sport and culture, the world can come closer together and develop friendships and networks that can stand against armed struggle and war as a way of pursuing conflict rather than talk and conversation. So that's how I would identify myself.
It's awesome. So I guess, not related, but related. So we're going to do some short questions. And so the first question I have in these introductory questions is where in the world is your favorite place to run, or where in your hometown is your favorite place to run?
Well, I've had wonderful runs all over Toronto and the GTA and in some other parts of the world. But for a big chunk of my life, I live very close to the waterworks in the east end of Toronto. And I would say that my favorite run is heading down the grass beside the waterworks, going down from Queen Street to the lake and along the sandy beach and then the boardwalk, all the way out to Woodbine or all the way out to the Leslie Street Spit or to Cherry Beach. And I have so many memories, so much joy, and going down that grassy hill at the start is such a wonderful way to warm up and start a run. Even though I haven't done it for several years, just thinking about it in response to your question, just brings back a rush of memories.
Oh, it's so awesome. Now so like I hear this downhill into the run. Now, did you have to run up the grass to get home?
Oh, sure, but I love hills. And I always love running up hills. So, in the end, it's a slight rise. It's not
Okay.
really but I always like hills and finishing running hard up that long straight, maybe
Oh,
300 meters.
yeah.
I mean, people think I'm crazy, but when I see a hill, I get excited. There's nothing better than just engaging in a hill and trying to fly up it.
Well, and
I used
I
to
mean to
say,
that, but you can't cheat going up hills, right? The only way to fly up a hill is to have really good form, right? And so it's like this, like it's like cheating work. But you're right. It feels so good. It feels so good.
you know, in my competitive days, I said to myself, nobody beats me up a hill.
Okay.
In cross-country races, I always made a point of sprinting off the top to leave people behind.
It's this like few seconds of like discomfort coming off the hill, but it like really mentally is challenging for your competitors when you're like, just going to embrace this pain, really put a little surge in, and off I go. Right. Anyways. Yeah. So on the topic of that, so we talked about your range. You've run, everything from the 440 yards up to the marathon. What's your favorite workout?
I ran a lot of intervals. I ran long intervals, training in the late 50s, early 60s. My hero, about whom I really only knew from reading and oral accounts, was Emil Zatopek. And the idea of doing relatively long repetitions it was something that I loved to do, and I think I thrived on. So a steady diet of 40 quarters, 20 halves, 10, 12, 3/4, 8 miles, varied Monday to Thursday. Those were my favorite workouts. And at the East York Track Club with Fred Foote, he would divide the club. So half the club would run the first half, the other half would run the second half, like sparring partners. And in the longer repeats, he would tell them to throw in bursts, so you would simulate race conditions, like improvisational theater, where the two actors are given different directions by the director, and out of a spontaneous interaction comes great theater. So those are my favorite workouts.
Now, just long interval. Like, what was the longest interval you had to run?
In Riverdale Park with cross country, there might be, if they weren't measured, they could be as much as, and remember, these were English distances then.
Yeah.
They could be as much as 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles. And I think in the off season, or in the build-up season of the early fall, we might run, repetitions of 1.5 miles with a break, 1.5 miles. But they weren't hard. They were just long, slow. It was like long,
Yeah.
slow intervals.
Yeah. Cool. So I steal this next question from Brené Brown's podcast. She's one of my favorite researchers. And so as it relates to running, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received? And as she says it, what's the shittiest piece of advice you've ever received?
Well, the shittiest piece of advice came very early in my career, when I'd already begun to attract media attention, and a CBC show connected me to an exercise physiologist in the very early days of exercise physiology to get the advice of a scientist. And his advice was to conserve energy by running at a steady speed all the way, regardless of how people set out in the race. Exactly. And I rejected that pretty quickly. The best advice I think I ever got was from Murray Hallberg, who was the Olympic champion in 1960, and against whom I ran and then became friends with. So sadly, Sir Murray, as he became, passed away a year or two ago, but just an extraordinary guy. And many stories about our relationship. I was, fiercely competitive with him until I realized that he was reaching out and being very supportive and avuncular with me. Somewhere along the line, he was talking about racing, and he said, and I wish I could remember his exact words, but there's a difference between leading and leading to fight for the finish. And think about a point in the race after which you don't want anybody other than yourself to be in the lead. Up to that point, don't worry about who's in the lead. Think about it strategically in terms of pace and other things, but if someone takes over the lead, that's okay. That's not your concern. Or you take it over, and share the lap duties for a while. That's okay too. But don't spend any emotional energy on your place at that. But when you decide to make your burst and go for it, you fight them off like it's the end of the world. And that's when you put all of your energy and your emotion into driving for the finish. And that's for a distance runner, a 5 or 10K runner, where there's a lot of jostling early in the race, where if someone, takes over with 6 laps to go, you could get worried because maybe you thought you might be in the lead. Don't worry about it. Remember, you've got a point beyond. Anyway, that was really, really good advice. Really good advice. And I'm not doing justice to his rich explanation.
No, it's great. I just actually finished Lauren Fleischman's book, Good for a Girl, and her decisive move was 600 meters. And it sounds like such similar advice. And she talked about how to learn to get really good at that, she had to let go of what was happening up until that 600 meters, right? Like, be in the right spot, don't spend the mental energy, the mental tickets, but that when it's time to go, you decisively go at 600 meters and make your move. And so a lot of what you just said resonated with just having finished Lauren's book. So I think, she's a great champion too, as are you. And it sounds like you guys were really good at making that decisive move. I'm not very good at it. I like to lead with about 10 meters to go, which doesn't really work out in the end, but that's okay. So the last question I have in these rapid fire questions are, what is your favorite post-race or post-workout snack or meal?
When I ran, the most important thing in my pre-race meal was to eat something that I could digest and enjoy, and not worry any more than that. I grew up with a mother who was a nutritionist, so almost everything I chose was beneficial. I had no trouble digesting most things. So I chose, and usually at a major race, you're some other place. I chose the meal that would put me in the best frame of mind. I felt that I'd enjoyed, not hated, my pre-race meal. And afterwards, what's available? depending on the temperature and what's available. There was a cross-country race in Buffalo. Maybe you ran it, Sasha, although I don't know whether it's still there, in Delaware Park, run by Canisius College. And it was a cross-country race around Canisius, around Delaware Park, an Olmsted designed park. And at the end of that race, they had just a large tureen of vegetable soup and bushel baskets of the freshest apples you ever ate. I would say for an immediate post-race snack or meal, that was always the highlight of my season.
That's pretty awesome. I mean, most people say like ice cream, burgers, but you're the like crisp apple to me. I'm like, okay, that actually might be the most winning thing, right? Like, oh, it hydrates you, it's sweet, it's delicious. It's kind of like, you know, I will respect our partners to the south and say like, you know, we share in this like apple orchard, apple familyness. Like it is, apples are almost like about community. So that's a to think about. I'll think about you every time I have an apple post workout, which is often my post workout snack. An apple, some almonds, and cheese, because apples and cheese are also delicious in my world. So I'm going to dive into the questions, dive into a runner's journey. But I'm actually going to sort of go to your other book, Tom Longboat, which I actually haven't read, but I'm definitely going to read. I've been chatting with Indigenous scholar Janice Forsyth, and she credits you with having helped to change the story about Tom Longboat. And so I thought before I asked you some detailed questions, I thought I might ask you to share your journey more about learning about Tom Longboat.
Well, I'm very proud of that. I was commissioned to write that book, and as you do, the first thing I did was go into the clipping files and all of the other books that have been written about Longboat, and learn that whether it was you know, a white settler writer or even an indigenous writer, the story about Longboat was that he had this amazing talent, which he dissipated by drinking too much, refusing to train, and basically not taking his running seriously. And sort of as a runner, it just made no sense to me. How could anybody line up on the starting line, hungover from drinking too much, and run faster than anybody else? Not over a sprint where it might be possible, but over 25 miles or a full marathon, which he raced over. So something didn't seem right. And I went to Six Nations to talk to people who still remembered him, including his children. And they told me that he always took very good care of himself. Up to the day he died, he walked everywhere, kept himself trim, and that he ran in the really the traditional style of the Hautestonis, who have always been famous runners. You know, the six nations of the Grand River and Upper New York State, and that was his training came out of that tradition, and his style of running and racing came out of that, and he was very proud of that tradition. So then I went back to the newspapers and started reading the accounts of the criticism of Longboat. And the criticism was that there were several kinds of criticism about his training. He refused to do, when he started off training in Toronto with the YMCA, they wanted him to train for the marathon by doing wind sprints, by doing short 100-meter, 200-meter repetitions. And that's an all. And he preferred to go long, slow distance. And there would be things like this, you know, racist slur Longboat refuses to train. He wouldn't do what trainer Ashley asked him to do. He just went out for a 20-mile jog. How many people easily jog 20 miles? So it was that kind of thing. On the on the booze, he was arrested on a number of times, in taverns. However, as a professional runner, which he became, you had to talk up your races. You had to promote the events that you were in. And the sporting crowd had hung out in taverns. And that's where he would go. And under the Indian Act of those years, just being physically present in a pub or a tavern was a violation of the law. And you read these stories and you realize that a lot of people came to his aid in these cases, but simply by being there. So that was another kind of story that that had a different side to it. But the most amazing thing is that he was supposed to be this irresponsible da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He was so mistreated. As a professional runner, his contract was sold to an American entrepreneur who, a famous entrepreneur by the name of Pat Powers, who moved him around from race to race, Canada, the United States, and in Europe. Longboat, with nothing but a lot of his own smarts, saved his money, bought up his own contract, and managed his own career for the last 3 or 4 years of the professional circuit, and ran faster than ever before, doing his own training. So rather than being, irresponsible, this guy knew his own body, knew how to get the most out of it, knew how to organize his own life. And this is at a time when in every professional sport, athletes were treated like peons, where every time there was an attempt at a labor union, that they were crushed. But Longboat took over his own life and succeeded. And I can go on and on and on. There are so many episodes of him in the 30s, in the Depression. Again, everybody's hurting. You see all the photographs of him coming to Toronto, beautifully dressed, driving his own car, signing autographs everywhere he went. He was not only an exceptional athlete, he could win from the front, he could win from behind. But he was a mensch, and he was someone who, overcoming tremendous hardship, took control of his own life and did better than ever before.
I'm super stoked to read more about Tom Longboat. My history on athletes in general is terrible. I secretly wanted to be an alpine ski racer when I was a child, so read more about that and like Bo Jackson. But I'm like now being like, I need to learn more about my running heroes. So I'm definitely going to read Tom Longboat. But, you talked about his long, slow distance, and I think it might be argued that he is, I'd actually say, not just the godfather, the grandfather of long, slow distance, but polarized training as well. And so, can you take us through what you learned about Tom Longboat? Like, he apparently also could put himself in like the depths of discomfort so that he could do those big workouts to set him up. He won Boston, I think, in 1917.
07.
I could probably get my dates wrong. Right. So what can you share with us about that polarized training that he did to make himself so great?
Well, he did a combination of long, slow distance and then some bursts of speed, drawing upon the Haudenosaunee tradition. And he wasn't the first to do that. If you look back in the earlier century, there are other famous runners, including one from Six Nations, who finished second in Boston a few years previously. But he beat in just in the years before the First World War, there was a professional indoor marathon circuit where two runners were matched against each other around 11 to the lap, 11 laps to the mile track, 301, 302 laps, and that would be the evening's entertainment. And they were promoted and matched like prize fighters. And Longboat was one of the stars on this circuit. And the classic race was against an Englishman who subsequently immigrated to Toronto and spent the last 30 or 40 or 50 years in Bowmanville, Alfie Shrub. And Alfie held the world record at 10, 12, and 15 miles. And they were matched in these races. And I'm going on too long here. So these races were classic tortoise hare races. Shrub would go out at the gun. He had more speed, perhaps, and he would lap Longboat again and again and again. Remember, these are 11 laps to the mile races. So in what became the big championship, he opened up a 15-lap lead by about 10 miles. Okay, and this is in Madison Square Garden in New York. It's standing room only. There's a band playing, and at some point, Shrub starts to tire, and Longboat speed gradually increases, and the chase is on. And Longboat would physically make a fishing motion, a casting and a fishing motion, as they came up behind. And I think he caught Shrub at 24 miles. And that was the world championship. And that race, you can look it up, that caused headlines all over the world. And that created such excitement that the promoters staged it again and again, sometimes over shorter distances, but the classic tortoise hare. Shrub was very entrepreneurial. He wrote a number of books, including How to Train. And he and Longboat became really good friends. And probably around my memory's not great, 1911, 1912, Shrub wrote another book on long distance running and basically changed his advice. And I've learned from my friend and great rival, Tom Longboat, that for the longest distances, and they didn't call it LSD then, but and so Shrub popularized what Longboat did and taught him. And that really was the basis for long, slow distance, at least in this part of North America.
Oh, it's such a fascinating story. I mean, it terrifies me to think about running a marathon on a 160-meter track, but I would, you know what? I would watch it. I think it would be really interesting to see.
Train loads of Torontonians, train loads of Montrealers would go down to these races to be there. I mean, this was a big deal. This was like a prize fight.
Oh, so cool. If only. So sort of moving through Tom Longboat's career as well, thinking about, when you sort of transition out of your career, it's challenging. And I think Tom Longboat faced even harsher criticism and a lot more racism as he transitioned out. What parallels did you and Tom Longboat face as you both transitioned, from your professional running careers to your professional career?
Well, there are very few parallels. He was a celebrated athlete, and he eventually got a job for the city of Toronto, and continued to gain appearance fees, and raised a family and lived the rest of his life. I am white, privileged, cisgendered, middle class, academic trained, and at a time when the economy was booming and jobs for university graduates were plentiful, when the university was expansion, there were a lot of opportunities for me, and I was able to experiment, I guess, and eventually landed at, I worked in the Treasury Board of Ontario. I worked as an educational officer for the Department of Education in Ontario, traveling around southern Ontario, giving advice on sport and recreation programs. I ran for public office, but all along I was involved in sport. I continued to run. When I ran, I started writing. I started becoming much more interested in the politics and economics of sport. And at a time when Avery Brundage was still the president of the IOC, and the belief was politics and sport do not mix, I gradually developed an outlook, an approach that I called the political economy of sport, and was able to sell articles or place academic articles with that perspective. And a few years later was able to convince both U of T and York to offer a course, an undergraduate course, on the political economy of Canadian sport, the very first course of its kind in North America. And that led to further opportunity, and that led to further opportunity. I think the other thing that really helped me was, so I worked in the Treasury Board. I then started teaching political science at U of T, but as a kind of sideline, I started teaching this course on the political economy of sport at York at U of T, and at U of T. In 1970, the IOC awarded the 1976 Olympics to Montreal. That decision was initially bitterly opposed by many people, perhaps even the majority, in both Quebec and English-speaking Canada, for all kinds of reasons, good and bad. It was going to lead to white elephants. Montreal had other social and environmental needs that were far more important. There was tremendous jealousy in English-speaking countries, in English-speaking Canada, that after Montreal had Expo, it was going to get another big prize. And. So it was, there were big political debates about it, into which I stepped with insights about the politics of sport. And I was so successful in doing that a few years later, the then director of, remember my background, my academic background was in political science and economics, although I had the sport background. So in 1973, Yuri Daniel, who was head of what is now the Faculty of Kinesiology at U of T, said, governments are now changing sport and recreation and physical education in Canada. With Sport Canada, with the Ontario Ministry of Sport and Culture, governments, your world, Sasha, is where governments have a very powerful say in the opportunities, in the events, in the financial support, in the awards, in the meanings. Well, that was all developing, and I was publicly talking and writing about that. So Yuri, the late Yuri Daniel, I'm sorry he's no longer with us, said, would you come and teach this stuff full time? So I said, sure, I'll do this for a couple of years, and I loved it. I loved it. I loved it.
I mean, your love for it and comes through in every way you talk about it. And it's, it's great to hear the story where the transition.
I learned so much from my students.
Yeah.
So one of the books that you mentioned is Athletes' Rights in Canada.
Yeah.
One of my students, Dan Thompson, on that 1980 Olympic team that never made it to Moscow, a year earlier was at the World Championships in swimming in Berlin. And two of his fellow swimmers were 5 minutes late for a curfew, and they were kicked off the team and sent home, losing their opportunities to compete and wrecking it for Dan because it killed the relay team. So he came to one of my classes and what about this? What about this? And I said, well, maybe we should do some research on this. And so I was energized by those students, all bright like Dan, with experiences that shed light on the way sports were being conducted in Canada, which led to research ideas, which led to publications, which led to academic brownie points, which led to change. So it was a very symbiotic relationship for me.
Which is awesome. And my next question relates to that very much. So, and I don't think this is actually your coaching environment, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you did grow up in a time when sort of a dictatorship for coaching was sort of the norm. And we've come a really long way from there for the most part. I mean, I watched the KPE sport. I keep wanting to call it the Sports Science Cafe, but it was the Sport Cafe. And Gretchen Kerr made that great comment, like really great things are happening in sport and, really focusing on like the majority, not the minority. So can you take us through some of those great changes that in coaching that have happened, since your time as an athlete to sort of where we are now?
Well, not all the coaches of my era were little Hitlers. Some of them were very, they may have been fatherly. There were very few women coaches, but they were volunteers. And they recognized that athletes were volunteers too. And so they were often, supportive and enabling. There were coaches and this was track and field, a highly individual sport. There were coaches, though, who abused their athletes, that is for sure. There were, there were athletes had very few rights when they felt that the discipline was overly harsh, when they were maltreated, when they were overlooked for selection, and so on. So I would say the last 50 years has been a series of struggles over making sport both accessible and humane. And that's not been a straight line, but it's kind of it's kind of come in waves. The 1960s radicalization spilled over in sport, and in many communities, athletes were very active, protesting, conducting sit-ins, organizing to change some of those conditions, and particularly in the United States, to overcome overt racism. With the Olympic Project for Human Rights, most remembered for Tommy Smith's and John Carlos's Black Power victory celebration at the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico. But that was not the only protest. There were probably 250 protests like that across universities and clubs in Canada and the United States. And many of those were successful in at least eliminating overt racism and bringing about important changes. There were changes in Canada, like the creation of the National Coaching Certification Program, which led to more science-based and pedagogical forms of coaching instruction. Because prior to the 70s, outside the universities, very few coaches had any kind of training. It was reproducing what they had learned and a lot of trial and error. So athlete protests, the effort by the first wave of governments in sport to make volunteer coaching more scientific and more educational, that would be a second one. Other campaigns for athletes' rights in the 1990s, some of which were successful and some were not. The Canadian Association of what is now Athletes Can was formed probably 1990. So athletes developed a collective voice. Not all victories were sustained. Sometimes they were short-lived and people had to reinvent the wheel. But it's been a series of changes over time. And I would say, most excitingly now, the Universal Code of Conduct to address and prevent maltreatment in sport, which is a pan-Canadian code of what's proper and what's improper in coaching and leadership, is a very important development, initiated by athletes on Athletes Can, and now being rolled out across Canada. And secondly, I believe the Office of Sport Integrity Commission will build upon the benefits of the Sport Dispute Resolution Centre of Canada to give athletes an independent mechanism to address their concerns.
Yeah, I saw you, and again, Gretchen, which I've referred to before, on that Safe Sport panel. And I think UCCMS, the Universal Code of Conduct and Maltreatment in Sport, is a great step forward. And I thought, I can't remember who said this out in Vancouver, and that these things take time. And it's been amazing progress in terms of what they've been able to do for safe sport in such a short amount of time. And I totally agree with that. I'd also like to get your opinion on, what are the things that we might currently be missing, or, the gaps that we really still need to close when it comes to safe sport?
Well, those are very, very important questions. It is early days for both the UCCMS and the OSIC, and there has to be supportive patient implementation, and that will take some time. I was involved in the creation of the Sport Dispute Resolution Centre of Canada, and it took us 4 years to get it up and running. So there's got to be some tolerance for the time to put in place a very careful mechanism. In the meantime, there's got to be counseling and support for athletes in crisis right now. And there's got to be full communication about the progress of implementation, because a lot of people, including myself, are too long in the dark when it comes to that implementation. Another important step that is underway but not realized is the creation of provincial and territorial mechanisms to align with. So at the moment, what's in place is only at the federal level, and the challenge is to bring the provincial and territorial jurisdictions in line. It's slowly happening. Quebec has its own system, not perfectly in line, but it's there for athletes in Quebec. Last weekend, Nova Scotia announced that it would sign up with the Office of Sport Integrity Commission, and I believe New Brunswick is about to do that. But there are 6 other provinces that have not done. There was a sports ministers meeting in PEI on the weekend, and the communication said that everybody has agreed to do something by the end of this calendar year. But we've got to keep their feet to the fire to make sure they do that. You know, wherever people are, write your provincial sports minister to say, when is it going to be in place here? And how will it align with the UCCMS and OSIC?
Yeah, I saw that. I saw an Adam Van Koeverden Instagram post of all of the sport ministers talking about that and committing to that. And you're right, we need to hold them accountable. I think we will have, with Adam in Ontario, some accountability here. I think Pascal Saint-Onge has got, you know, you said Quebec's already got a mechanism in place. So it'd be great if they could also take, you know, their energy and their passion and go, you know, visit the other provinces to hopefully, you know, as you say, light a fire there to get this going.
Yeah,
You know,
and they've been slow. I mean, anyway, they've used the excuse of COVID far too long to delay implementation. So thank you for your question.
Thanks. So I'm going to totally pivot now. So my favorite part of your book was when you talked about physical activity and physical literacy as a course that all students should take while they're at the University of Toronto. So I taught in engineering and engineering science, and I promise you that all of those students need that. But we're also at a point where we have the evidence-based research that actually says when you're physically active, you know, we tell them, oh, it's better for your mental health, it's good for sleeping, it's good for nutrition. But, you know, relating to these engineering science students, I'm like, it actually makes your grades go up too. So speaking their language. So, you know, can you talk us through some of that and how you might even see implementing that now? Not just at the University of Toronto, but, you know, pan-Canadian campus wide.
It's another uphill battle. Sadly, we used to have it. When I was an undergraduate years ago, there were 2 years of compulsory physical activity for all undergraduate students, but that was eliminated. So we have to bring it back. And it's going to be an uphill slog, I think, to reestablish the respect for physical education in the educational realm. You know, first of all, we need to convince people that, and I hope a lot of people are listening to you, that it's essential to not only effective health but effective learning, and that people who are inactive and unfit are not very effective learners. They're overly stressed and so on. But at the moment, we're boy, oh boy, I can't promise any quick fixes, because I feel that over the last 10 years, it's a harder and harder sell.
I agree. And I've been thinking about this a lot. And I took gym because I was good at sport and I could do well in gym. I skipped grade 11 girls gym because it was gymnastics and artistic swimming. And I was like, well, I'm not going to get a good grade there. But I think is in the same idea that, you know, like this polarizing of high performance sport and community sport, where what if instead we had courses in high school and in university, right? We got to play the grades game. And so teaching them physical culture. And so it's about moving through the process, learning something, and I guess in a way, figuring out how to assess them if they'll still stay physically literate for life, as opposed to saying you need to come in and be like LeBron James at basketball to get 100%, right? Like it's unrealistic. Or you've got to run a Bruce Kid mile to get an A in this course, right? It's such a barrier to entry for most athletes. And so, you know, maybe some of your thoughts around how we could change how we think about assessing physical culture and physical education.
Well, first of all, people have to be grouped on the basis of their physical abilities and their experience rather on their academic grade. Because as in your grade 11 phys ed class, you had all these abilities and many other people were embarrassed to be there by comparison, and they didn't enjoy being there, and they didn't learn very much. There have been some very telling experiments where when students are grouped by their physical activity grade, they can learn effectively. Secondly, I would put the focus on pleasure and self-directed, learning, strength building, and so on, so that the students would gain what you and I have had all our lives, the confidence that this is important to them, that this is good for them, and they know what they can do best themselves, even though from time to time they get assistance or they get that specific coaching and so on. What I'm not very good at is there is, I mean, it drives me crazy. You talk about physical education K to 12 and physical education throughout university, and people look askance after. But those same people, and certainly their parents, will spend a lot of money to sign up for a health club membership. Or they oppose physical education in the public schools, but they'll send their child to a private school with a good sports program. I haven't figured out the contradictions there. I'm a public sector person, and I think that the route is to make it available for everyone. I think that there's too much class envy associated with some forms of physical education and physical activity, and I wish I knew how to break that down. I wish I knew how to make instruction and activity much less expensive that it's become, in private clubs and private schools. We're facing very, very big problems, but I'm confident that you can teach every child to enjoy and to self-manage healthy physical activity on a daily or at least regular basis.
I totally agree. And sort of related to that, I think all students would do better in math if they just went outside and played some and then did their math, as opposed to having an hour of math class. Because even as somebody who loves math, I need a break, right? 30 minutes is good. And let's go play outside, figure out how the math might even relate to what we're doing outside, and then come back in and do it again. Bruce, I could talk to you forever. You're a wonderful soul. You do so much for the world, and I can't thank you enough. There's a few minutes left, and I will open the floor now to anybody else here who wants to ask a question. Yeah, I probably will try and read probably all 10. I'll probably buy your kids' books too. I'm probably going to try and read all of your books, Bruce. Okay. I love to read. I guess if nobody has any questions, is there anything? Oh, there's a question there we go. Nevin, go ahead.
Hi there, Professor Kidd. I'm the son of a high school track coach in Hamilton, so I grew up hearing legendary stories of yourself racing, and it's the first time I've heard you speak, so thank you so much, Sasha, for organizing this. Question in terms of running in Canada, I think, is going through a massive boom in terms of participation in road races and trail races, and a certain running chain has done very well in Canada and that sort of thing. But I think that there's less and less of a connection between the running community and the national teams and our elites and that sort of thing. And when I hear stories of how big, I grew up in Hamilton going to Spec Games, how big the Maple Leaf games were, and these stories of how big track was, and that sort of thing. My dad taught me that after a race, you should check out who won your category and who won the elite category, and you should know their names of those fast people. I don't think there's that connection today, and I don't know, is there a way of connecting those, whether the average Toronto road runner should know who the Stafford sisters are? And is this on Athletics Canada? Is this on more the sport management side to fix this? Because there's a lot of role models out there. There's a lot of like, they don't have to know the names of our elites. I think our elites are missing out in terms of financial support and that sort of thing. How did we kind of get here, and any advice to go back? I also really enjoyed your comments around physical literacy and that sort of thing. A quick shout out to the Adventure Running Kids program in Hamilton. It's the most unknown, incredibly successful kids running program in the country. They've had thousands and thousands of kids go through it. Because it came out of an orienteering background and not a pure running background, it hasn't been picked up, but it's probably, I don't know. I don't think there's a better kids running program in the world, and it's an hour away from Toronto. So thanks so much.
Okay, well, Nevin, thank you very, very much. It troubles me, the disconnect between all of the runners I see out on my walks and rides, and highly competitive track and field and highly competitive road running. The disconnect between road running and track and field really, really bugs me. You know, the running around in circles on a fast track is only followed, you know, every 2 or every 4 years. And I, like you, worry about that connection. I mean, and, you know, I grew up when we filled every arena we ran in. We filled most stadiums that we ran in, and they were stadiums of 20, 25,000 seats. When our races were covered on the front page of the sports page or on the front page of the newspaper. So I don't understand quite. I do, you know, can Athletics Canada do a better job of promotion? I don't know if there's one quick fix. I'm sorry that track and field is not as strong as it used to be in the schools, which is a great place to learn the sport and to connect the sport with Sasha and the Stafford sisters and those amazing athletes. I think you posed the problem very well. I'm not sure what the solution is. I mean, there should be an excitement about watching somebody run fast, and people who vie with other people around the world at track meets around the world. But the following for that is relatively small, as you point out, in this country, and it's crazy. I would say people in the United States share the same concerns.
Just a quick follow-up on that. It's incredibly frustrating as a Canadian, because Canadians love the Olympics more than almost anyone but the Norwegians. And when we get to the next Olympics, the coverage and people are going to know every member of our 4x4 teams and all of that, and they get so into it, and then it's kind of tunes off for another 4 years. And I don't have solutions either in terms of what could be bridging that gap. But I think it has to be, the onus is on, I think, the elite programs and the sport managers to try to make that connection, because the community, the participatory people are doing fine on their own.
Yes. In the chat line, someone says, remembers when Lanny ran a small program for kids before a 5K race. I mean, if there was an invitational race at every school track meet, you know, at OSTA, regionals and so on, maybe that is a way of making that connection, because these are remarkable athletes. But I'm spinning my wheels here. Thank you very much for your question and observation.
So Nevin, one idea I have, which is like one idea I already do, and so I often go and be the bunny at the local elementary cross country meets.
Oh, good.
And so you line up. Well, you don't line up. You got to be out a little bit ahead. They really sprint fast to start. But you give every one of those kids a high five right before they start. And I often have my Team Canada gear on, and a couple parents start to ask questions, and it engages me with that community. And more importantly, it engages with a community that's going to grow up, which we hopefully, you know, that next Gabriella or Lucia Stafford is standing on that start line. And I think it's those small things. But Nevin, I'm definitely going to take that question back to my lab meeting on Friday and see if there's a way that we can actually think about asking that in an academic way that's practical to bring this back. Okay, so respecting Bruce's time, because it is 5:03,
Okay.
so it's 8:03. Yeah.
Well, you know, maybe there's got to be, I don't know, I'm not as media savvy as you are, but I log into CBC Sports on Sunday, and I watch the clips of Canadians, not only in track and field, but in every sport, doing well internationally. And it bugs me that that's not available on the main television, but I get to see it. Maybe Athletes Canada, or maybe Athletics Canada, or Athletics Ontario has got to just have a steady thing of clips, and then people through word of mouth get that out there. Because, and this is another thing that was important to me in my watching top runners run is so exciting that does inspire. And, you know, watching people jog is okay, but there's nothing the same as watching someone like fly. And to fly at a well-attended track meet, that is such, you know, such a pleasure. And very few Canadians see that anymore.
That's a great point. I wonder if it's actually engaging with the CBC to say, you know, let go of the licensing around this for a very like specific proportion of people, the Athletics Canada, the Athletics Ontario people, literally like the individual athletes, right? Like give me my pictures and give me my videos, where I am then required to tag that sports outlet, right? And to share my story behind what they're showing as well, to make a connection. You know, like one of my favorite things to do while I'm out running is to smile and say hi to every other person out running, walking, biking, everything. You get a little like winded sometimes when there's enough people, but creating that engagement. And so if you then have this background story, you know, and those few times where people are like, I recognize you from here, does that happen with more people? You know, like the Stafford sisters run in Toronto. You know, Matt Hughes ran in the city all the time. Andrew Alexander is now training in Hyde Park. He's often wearing his Canada gear, right? Like that tells a story. And then, you know, starting to do that with some other sports as well. That's a phenomenal idea, Bruce. I'm on it. I don't know the powers that be at CBC, but I'll figure out who the powers are at CBC and start letter writing campaigning. So I think with that, I'm going to hit stop recording, which I can't find, of course, on my screen.